Who doesn't love an underdog story? David against Goliath, Sparta defying the huge army of Persia, or more recently, Paraguay shocking Germany in the Soccer World Cup. Now, today we're going to review a game that fits in this category. On one end, we have Alexandra Botez from Botez Sisters and a Woman FIDE Master, one of the most famous chess streamers. And on the other end, we have Kawji Senna, one student from our academy, which is rated around 1600. Now, this game will feature a French defense. This starts with e4, e6, d4, and d5. And here I really like that Senna went for the exchange variation. Now, if you have this position and see it from Botez's perspective, whenever you are playing someone who is 400 points below your rating, you really want to crush them. So for that, you want to have either a tactical mess or a strategical complication that it is very hard to fight. Now, this position instead features a position that is more solid, where white can develop very easily, and that in this case, as we will see, white had already a plan. That is a very good one. Now, the game continued with bishop d3 and bishop d6. However, I think that the plan with c5 would have been a better choice for Botez, because in this case, the main line goes with pawn takes and bishop takes, which features a very typical game with an isolated pawn, d5, where black gives some structural weakness, but instead gets a lot of activity with the bishops and with the space. And if, for example, Senna would have continued with his setup, after knight f6, knight e2, knight c6, and castle, here black have different options, such as c4, or for example, bishop e7, where if white takes, bishop takes, will feature again that same isolated pawn middle game. However, also c4 could be very interesting, creating some attacking chances on the queen side. And these positions tend to be way more complex. Now, that already puts some pressure on Alexandra to do something either in the middle game or in the late opening. But well, let's continue with the game. This continue with bishop d6, knight e2, knight f6, and both castled. So this is very important. Whenever you are playing a chess game, remember to develop your pieces, get your king safe as fast as possible. And as we see, both players did it very quickly. Now white went for c3 and c6, and this knight here on e2 that could seem a little bit weird has two reasons. The first one, you stop those ideas of bishop g4 pinning over knight, and second, and the most important, you can play now bishop f4. Now in this case, we want to trade our bad bishop for their good bishop. For those of you who doesn't know, a bad bishop is the one who is shocking with their own pawn structure. So in this case, you can see our main pawn structure is in the dark squares, and our bishop is a dark square bishop. While the black bishop, in this case, which is the black squares as well, is a good bishop because the main pawn structure is a light square. So this is a very good strategical plan. Here, black played bishop g4, and before continuing, notice that in this position we have an immense drawing chances of over 50%. Okay, that means that every two games, at least one of them is drawn, which is very huge. The lines that I presented at the beginning has instead around 25 or 30% chance, which is way lower, and that also proves that those positions tend to be more complicated. Now let's continue with this game. So far, both players have been doing a great job. The game continued with bishop takes d6 and queen takes d6. Now notice that the times right now are still very similar. The game is 3 minutes with 2 seconds of increment, and this one was played in the Naroditsky Memorial. That's why they are both playing very fast, and we'll see that some of the plans are very basic because that happens a lot in blitz games. Now, after bishop h5, queen c2, stepping us out of the pin, excellent movement by Senna. Black continued with the development, knight b7. White finished his development and put the rooks in contact with knight d2, and here black made the first attacking move with knight d2, forcing white to do something about it. In this case, white continue with knight g3, and white is attacking the bishop on h5. Notice that if in this position you play something, let's say normal, but that doesn't pay attention to the threats like rook e7, something like knight f5 can happen, and this would be a fork. So let's pick another movement, like rook e6, for example. Here we can see that after knight takes bishop and knight takes knight, white can take the pawn on h7. So there is a hidden threat with the last movement of white. Now, of course, Botez saw this happening and this threat, of course, and decided to move the bishop to g6. Here, white decided to trade the bishops, and black took a very risky decision by taking with the f pawn. Now, I'm 100% sure that Alexandra knew that the best movement was h takes g6. Usually, a good rule of thumb when you are playing chess and you need to take with one of the two of pawns, right? And both of them will end up being doubled. You want to bring your pawns towards the center, okay? Notice that by doing this, in this case, you are controlling way more squares. And there is another reason. If this pawn at any point needs to go to e4 because it is traded, if you take with the h pawn, this still remains to be only one island, while if you took with the f pawn, that pawn will be isolated. So there are several reasons, but in general, taking always towards the center is going to be more solid and a better movement. It doesn't matter in the most cases the activity that you will gain. However, in this case, Botez really wanted to create some asymmetry in the position and try to create some complications. And that's why she decided to take with the f pawn, opening the f file for the rooks. And notice that almost all the pieces of black is playing. The knight on d7 maybe can still take a little bit of time, but if you move knight e4, then knight will come. So she's betting that her activity is going to be enough that will compensate that strategical decision that is compromising her position. So now let's continue with the game. In this case, white played rook fe1, and white decided to play queen f4. Now, I slightly prefer in this position something like g5. You really want to put pressure on your opponent very early on where the pieces are not yet prepared. And for example, if white continue with a normal movement like knight f3, notice that after g4, pawn takes, knight takes, you're already creating some very worrying threats for your opponent. And if white continue with knight f5 instead, for example, well, queen f4, and the queen is active, then that knight is a little bit suspicious. And something like knight df1 instead seems okay, but again, after g4, h4, this one would be probably one of the best options for black, but still you can try to improve your pieces going with the knight to b6 and c4 and just keep going with the game. But you're already putting a lot of pressure on your opponent. That's something that you really want to do. But let's continue. After queen f4, white played a very good movement, very simple but very good. In this case, black wants to create problems on the weakness on f2. So white decided to play knight f3. And this movement serves two purposes. The first one, it blockades the file where the queen is acting. And the second one is making the queen protect that precious pawn and precious square. Now black continue attacking knight e4, and here white decided to trade pieces and move to h2, which is the most natural move and the only move in this case. Black continue knight f6, trying to activate the pieces, and here again Senna is playing very good, trying to play with all the pieces that she has. Rook e2, opening the spot for the other rook to come to e1. Now the game continues. Rook e7, rook a e1, rook f e8. Black creates some interesting threats trying to go for the e3 line. Now in this case, notice that this queen is doing a job, both rooks are doing a job. The only place which is misplaced is the knight. So she went with the knight to f1, maneuvering with the knight and improving that piece. Now the game continues with g5. Now Alexandra wants to break in the king side and wants to go with g4. But in this case, notice that white is way more prepared There are less pieces on the board, most pieces are doing something, and the knight can jump to e3, stopping that threat of g4. Black continue playing h5, trying to go for that, but this is now weakening too much the king side, and we'll see that white really do something to attack and take advantage of that. So white played queen b3 check, black continue with king h8, and now white continue with d5. Now, in this position, I think knight c4 could have been a very nice option, but you need to see what happens against g4, which is a little bit shady. While d5, I think it is a very good movement that tries to simplify the position and that makes black the temptation to take on d5, which is very normal. Whenever you are in blitz games, sometimes when you see a capture, you do it because you kind of want to make some progress. But in this case, I really don't like taking the pawn, and instead I would have preferred to see a movement like g4 creating problems. For example, if white makes this blunder, we can just take on h3, and already white's position seems to be collapsing. And probably what we'd have seen is taking back on g4, pawn takes, and now if white decides to take on c6, we just takes, and yeah, we again have a horrible pawn structure, but we keep a lot of chances. Probably something like knight f1 would have been a good movement, but for example, rook e5, and if g3, we can try to go to the h file and create problems there. Now let's continue, because in the game, Alexandra took on d5, which I think it is a mistake, because now it is going to be very hard for you to create complication after white takes here, because now you need to trade the knight. You are forced to do it. Knight takes, queen takes. Black continue with b6. That's because notice that if black tried to play g4, oh no, sayonara to that pawn, bye-bye. Yummy yummy in my tummy, check, and that's a big problem. And if you do something like e3, for example, we can just trade everything, and after the rook takes, notice that the b7 pawn is going to be in danger, and the back rank is also going to be in danger. So that's going to be a no-no for that line. So in this case, b6, some prophylaxis, trying to stop that pawn from being captured in the future. However, now white stopped the only source of counterplay of black by playing rook e3. The game continued rook e5, queen d7, and rook e7. Here, Kawji played queen d4, but I think the best movement to do is queen d1. Now, you really want to do this. You need to look at the weaknesses of your opponent and try to attack them, because it is going to be very hard for him to keep everything together. For example, if black decides to go something like g4, after trading the pawns, rook g3, that pawn will be taken. And if instead black needs to do something like g6, it's going to create a lot more weaknesses on the king side, which is horrible. And if you play something like queen f7, well, right now you are the one who is playing passively, and that won't lead to anything good, because at the end you have a worse pawn structure. For example, queen e2, now that I'm looking at the game, seems a horrible idea. I don't know. I mean, maybe queen g6 would be the only possibility, and that seems really poor from black. So let's continue with the game. Queen d4, excellent movement in any case. I mean, the queen is protected, attacking d5. The game continues with g4, pawn takes, g3, queen f5, king g2. Notice that now white is opening that square for the rook for possible attacks, and black decided to go with rook d7. Now, this is a mistake. I think that rook h1 was a very good movement from Senna. You enter into a game that is going to be very easy. However, white had the chance to play rook takes e4 because you are attacking on e8. Now, if the game continues queen f3 check, you can just move away. And now if black takes the queen, we can take on e8, checky. And after king h7, we'll take the rook, and we'll have a very beautiful post pawn, two rooks. And this is going to be very hard for black to face. Now understand that these type of positions tend to be very complicated, especially for a 1500 player, because the queens can be very tricky. There are a lot of forks possibilities, skewers, sometimes with low time that can be very hard to play. So the option that white did, rook h1, I think is a great option, because now after king g8 and queen c4, you are forcing black to play queen d5 and trade queens, which is something that you don't really like because now you have the weaknesses and you are in an endgame which is worse. And at the same time, in this case, white was very happy taking a draw, and this game is going to be very hard to lose. Now, in this position, white misplayed a little bit the game, played rook h4 and let black enter into the 7th rank. So after some movements, rook takes pawn, a4, rook b3, and the trade of rooks, we have a very even endgame. However, notice that both players have only 10 seconds to play and the increment of each movement, but this position tends to be very complicated. Now, white played an excellent movement, rook e7. Whenever you are in an endgame, you need to keep the activity, okay? Some players, whenever they are in endgames, they relax, they say like, oh, I'm going to draw here with any movement, and that's not true. You need to keep your pieces active, and the king should also be active. In this case, it is very important to notice that none of the players has pass pawns, so the game should end up in a draw. Now, what probably happened here is that Alexandra was trying to come up with ways to make the game more complicated. Probably was also under a lot of pressure, and it was the first round, so usually in those first rounds, at least in my experience, we tend to be rusty and make more mistakes. And something that I want to say first is, I mean, again, congratulations to Senna. This type of position is sometimes it's easy to misplay, but white kept all the pawns in good squares, didn't blunder any material under the trying pressure, which is really complicated, okay? And after some movements, the game was again in equality, but in this position, Alexandra flagged and lost the game, giving Senna the victory. Now, probably again, she was kind of frustrated with all the game and how it go, and was trying to create complications, over thought for a moment, and ended up losing on time. So, again, congratulations to Senna. Excellent game. She didn't over push in the position. She didn't overplay. She had confidence on her endgame and positional skills, and she didn't blunder, and ended up winning by flagging her opponent. So, congratulations also to Alejandro, Senna's coach. And well, if you want to step up your chess game, improve your abilities, win against FIDE Masters as well, follow MM Chess, drop a comment below, and see you in training.